Hi, welcome to another When Extra session on writing materials for pronunciation. So in this session, I'm going to give you a few tips on writing materials for pronunciation, both in terms of materials that explicitly only deal with pronunciation and also looking at materials when we integrate pronunciation into our lesson materials. We're basically going to cover 5 main areas. We're going to begin by looking at the ways in which we define our approach. There are different approaches to writing materials for pronunciation, different approaches to teaching it in the classroom. So we're going to consider those approaches and how they affect the materials writer. We're going to look at some pretty basic exercise types for presenting pronunciation and also practicing it. Pronunciation is often quite controlled. Some of the exercise types are quite basic. As a materials writer, particularly if you're writing for a publisher, you might be asked to script pronunciation, audio scripts for recordings, and there's a few considerations for that. And also, we're going to look at ways in which you can record pronunciation exercises, possibly at home or at your place of work. Fourthly, we'll look at a few game-like activities. Pronunciation exercises can often be a bit dull, a bit mechanical, but there's a few gamey type ways you can write materials to make them a bit more interesting and jump off the page. And we'll finish with some questions to ask yourself, sort of reflective questions. So when you're writing pronunciation exercises or you're considering how to integrate them into your materials, some questions to consider at the end. Also at the end, I'll suggest some further reading, some reference books. I'll be referring to this book quite a bit. It's a book I wrote with Gerard Erasmus called ETpedia Pronunciation, full of exercise type. It also has a section on writing materials for pronunciation, so I'll be referring to that a little bit. But as I say, I'll include some other books on the topic that are specifically useful for materials writers. Okay, let's get started. I want to start with this quote from Adrian Underhill, which comes from ETpedia Pronunciation. We asked Adrian for his thoughts and comments on pronunciation. He describes it as the Cinderella of English language teaching. She's a kind of an outcast, overshadowed by her two also beautiful sisters, grammar and vocabulary. And what Adrian's saying is here, for a very long time in most lessons, and this is reflected in course materials, pronunciation is always kind of secondary. Okay, to illustrate the point that Adrian's making, here's an extract from a book I worked on, an elementary level book. And notice how the grammar is emphasized as a big yellow box. The heading is very large, and the exercise that follows practices the grammar point. But then if we focus in on the pronunciation exercise, it's really useful at elementary for students to notice the similarities and the differences in sounds with, say, their, he's, his. But the pronunciation is kind of secondary. The font is smaller. It's integrated into the flow of the exercise. There isn't a big yellow box explaining the pronunciation. And that's quite a typical approach in course materials. Let's contrast it with another approach. This is another book I also worked on, an elementary level book, but just notice the difference. We've got a big pronunciation box. It's explaining the rule of rise, fall, intonation, and then there are some really controlled practice exercises. So the prominence of pronunciation in this book is much greater. Now, in both those exercises, the approach is to isolate the pronunciation almost and teach it as a feature. The issue with that, it presents a viewpoint that there is a standard pronunciation. And quite often we have, say, students listen and repeat. So they listen to, if you like, the correct form and they repeat it. Now, of course, in recent years, the issue is, well, what is the correct form? Is it some sort of British English spoken by the royal family? Is it an American English based on a kind of Midwest standard? Or Or is the standard, if you like, from Australia, Ireland, or is it not from a country where English is the first or official language? It's English as a second language spoken by somebody, say, from Brazil, whose first language is Portuguese, but they have English as a second language. And we're starting to see that issue reflected in materials design, and quite often it's integrated into authentic listening. So one way to deal with pronunciation, a different approach, is to take authentic pieces of English and identify the pronunciation features. Let me show you what I mean. So this is from a website I like called Ello. They take authentic listenings, and they give you the script. There's a kind of a quiz, and there's vocabulary related to the listening. So it's listening practice. But what's interesting is here, you notice the flags. They make sure that they have a range of different Englishes, different accents, different pronunciations, and they don't rewrite the script to give some sort of correct version. And this use of authentic listenings to present, if you like, authentic pronunciation is becoming a really influential feature of materials, and it's something I'm trying to include much more in my materials, particularly with the use of video, because you can video people talking. So following on from this idea of exposing students to more real types of English in our materials design, I just want to finally refer to the work of Gemma Archer. Gemma is part of the IATEFL pronunciation SIG. Google her name, Gemma Archer, pronunciation ELT, you'll come across some of her work. She's done some really interesting things related to different pronunciations and getting students to notice different pronunciations. She gives a wonderful example, because Gemma is from Scotland, but she's working from a student who's come to live in Scotland, and the student hears the phrase at the local hospital. Somebody says, the student has gone to the hospital, and somebody said to the student, but it's ut of ooze. And the student couldn't understand this phrase, ut of ooze, and went back to Gemma and asked about it. And Gemma realized that the student was hearing the phrase out of hours. You can see it on the hospital sign there. So Gemma talks about developing this approach to use these things as an opportunity for students to consider issues about the pronunciation and hear it. So ask questions, and you could include this kind of thing in your materials design. You might say to the student, well, what did you hear on the video or in the recording, and why do you think they pronounced it like that? What's happening with the pronunciation? Discussion questions like, is it okay to pronounce it like that? And is there any other way to pronounce it? So you're taking the authentic chunk out of hours, and you're using it as the basis for students to consider different pronunciations and really explore it in depth. And I think there's a lot more scope in materials design for us to do that. So something to consider as we're working through this. Okay, let's start with the basics of writing materials for pronunciation, and then we'll explore some of these issues in more detail. So I want us to consider basic present and practice exercises, and I want to show you, I love this picture. It's from a book written in 1938. It was actually in a book called English Grammar, which contained lots of illustrations, but it had a section on pronunciation. And this is a nice example from nearly 100 years ago of the author trying to present the mouth shape that students needed to produce certain sounds. So we get the one in the middle is going oh, 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 and ah, ah, ah. And the little drawings show the shape of the lips. If you look across to the right, you can see f, f, f. So the teeth on the lower lip, and then the one on the left is going r, r, although I don't think the illustration particularly helps in that case. This is a very overt way of presenting, and actually illustration and pictures used to be used a lot in pronunciation materials, and I think they're due a comeback. This was my own work where I photographed my own mouth to introduce, when I'm writing some materials to introduce the sounds E, O, and R. And you can create little quizzes where students have to consider the words are, not, eat, and then guess which mouth is saying those words. So number 1 is saying eat, number 2 is saying are, and number 3 is saying not. It's the same principle as those illustrations, but it's a way of getting students to think about the shape of their mouth. Again, consider we're presenting a standard. I'm presenting probably a British English way of saying those words. It doesn't allow for variations in other accents, so that's an issue. Another approach to presenting pronunciation, this comes from the National Geographic Learning book Voices, which has pronunciation as a sort of feature, particularly international pronunciation, English as a lingua franca. But it takes the approach of describing to the student how to produce the sounds and what the differences are in the sounds. For me, I find I have an issue with this because this description uses phrases like comes out of your mouth or there is voice from the throat. Well, at elementary level, students won't have this meta language. So you're going to have to teach the language to talk about pronunciation. Arguably, that's no different from teaching the meta language to talk about grammar. I mean, most people, if you said to them the word present simple, they wouldn't know it, whereas your elementary student probably does learn that phrase. It's another way of presenting pronunciation here, but through text. So it's another option for you to consider. Other ways to present pronunciation is actually quite often course materials, video-based materials will present somebody speaking, so it's like a listening exercise, and then they'll get you to identify or notice pronunciation issues within the listening. And that's another way to present it. You know, ask the students, well, what do you hear? What's actually happening in speech? And that's the approach you might take if you were presenting pronunciation via a listening text or via an audio. Let's move on to some very basic exercise types for practicing, presenting and practicing pronunciation. This is what you see on the screen now is a very basic exercise. It's pronunciation linked to the idea of different word forms or word roots. So we've got the word root compete. Students learn they can say competitive, competitor, competition. But once they've done that, they're listening and noticing that the stressed syllable moves. We go from compete, competitive, competitor, so it's always the syllable after com, the pet bit, but in competition, it moves to the third syllable. So those are kind of noticing activities which we often use in pronunciation materials after we've presented grammar and pronunciation. Here's another sort of listen, notice, and match. So this is connected with sound and spelling. So we match the word sad to the word bad, and then the word said to the word bed. And students start to notice that spelling doesn't necessarily correspond to the same pronunciation sounds. So they're having to think about vowel sounds. We get words like side, lied, sowed, owed, seed, heed. Again, it's listen, it's notice. Here they have to draw a line, so there is an exercise involved. It's very controlled, all dealing with pronunciation at a very segmental level. Often exercises which involve an element of listen and fill the gaps. This exercise is focused on getting students to become aware of connected speech, because you get would you like a cup of tea? Well, those words are linked. You get would ya and cuppa, cup of, cuppa, or could I have an apple, for example, could I and an apple, or do you mind giving me a lift? So that's just getting them to tune into connected speech. It's a good exercise for developing kind of listening skills. The next one is starting to get students to actually speak and produce it themselves. So listen and repeat the sentences. So they're listening and the focus is on intonation and probably on whether the question rises or falls at the end. Again, very mechanical. So at this sentence level, this segmental level, if you like, some of those are super segmental exercises like the connected speech exercises. It's making students aware of change in phonemes. It's making them aware of connected speech, of stress patterns, intonation patterns. But it's very controlled. It's all about presenting and practicing in a very controlled way. Now, in a minute, we'll look at some freer practice pronunciation exercises, but a couple of words about scripting this type of exercise. If you write for publishers, you'll have to produce a script. If you're writing for your own purposes and you're going to record something and you're going to get some friends to record it, it's still worth scripting it. So if I was doing exercises focused on the phonemes b and p, which some students have problems with because the difference in those two sounds don't exist in their own language, I might write something mechanical like just look at some words like ball, Paul, so minimal pairs basically. And if I'm scripting it for actors, I want them to say the words clearly, ball, Paul, and then I need a 3-second pause between each sentence so students have time maybe to do an exercise or to listen and repeat, or just to process what they've heard. Or a teacher might want to pause and play it again. So you need to script in those pauses into your scripts. Here's an example of how it might be used. So students have to listen and tick the word they hear. Do they hear the b or the p sound? And there you can see the audio script below. And voice one says ball, so they're going to tick the b sound, but they need time to do that. So you indicate a 3-second pause in your writing. Basic tips, but really useful, particularly if you're working with actors. If you're writing longer scripts for somebody to record, so this is the beginning of a script or a listening where students are going to listen to a presentation. It was for an English for academic purposes piece of material. So it's a technical presentation about photosynthesis. Students are going to listen to it, and then we're going to use it as a model for them to create their own presentations. But I want the actors to deliver it in a certain way. So I'm going to underline any words which I want stressed in a certain way, and where I maybe want pauses in the presentation to illustrate chunking in language. So the actor's going to read it something like, "Good morning, everyone, and thanks for coming. Today, I'd like to give a short presentation about a scientific process called photosynthesis." And the actor needs those kind of indicators just to help with the delivery. So anything you can give the person who's recording the text is really helpful. One other tip, if you're going to record texts for your pronunciation lessons, maybe you're not using a recording studio, you're just recording it at home or at work, there are plenty of really nice recording tools out there. Vocaroo is one of the most famous, really simple website. You go to the website, you press the microphone, it records you. You can also record pretty good quality now on a decent phone. Just use the record function or download an app, and you'll get pretty basic and good recordings that you can then edit. If you're going to start doing it professionally, you probably want a good quality microphone. This is a Yeti microphone, which I use. People use them for podcasting. There are other microphones out there. The webcam that I'm speaking to at the moment is using its internal microphone, and the sound quality is pretty good. If you're going to go beyond that, you're going to need to probably move on to some sort of recording studio facility. And if I was putting together like a whole series of materials for a very long course, then I'd probably want to consider doing the whole thing in a recording studio and possibly getting actors in. Or if you're going to do materials where you're recording authentic interviews, so you get different accents for students to listen to, again, you're really going to have to consider miking up the people you're interviewing, because sound quality is everything when you're producing materials for pronunciation and listening lessons, obviously. Okay, so far we've considered approach, we've looked at some basic exercises for presenting and practice, and we've considered scripting and recording. Let's move on to point 4, game-like activities. These are just some examples from Eatipedia pronunciation. They're typical of the sort of the one-page downloadables that you can then cut out and use in class to create sort of in-class games. So this is classic dominoes. You would cut all of these up into separate dominoes. Groups of students would get a set. And basically, this one is designed to match the phoneme to the word with that sound. So this one is introducing vowel sounds. You match E to me, it to sit, oo to good, and students try to lay the dominoes down. Dominoes can be created for all sorts of things. You could do it for consonant sounds. You can do it for word stress sounds. So we could imagine a teacher's just introduced lots of country names, and now students are being introduced to the word stress patterns and have to match the country to the word stress pattern that it has. Bingo's another possibility. These are bingo cards where the teacher hands out a different card to different students and then calls out the phonemes at random, or says a word with the phoneme in at random until a student has, like bingo, crossed 4 of them or all of them on their card and shouts out bingo. Pelmanism, some people call it memory. It's where you have a set of cards and you lay them flat on the table and you play in groups. One student turns 2 cards over and tries to match them in some way. So these are homophone words. We've got allowed spelt in 2 different ways. They turn allowed over and they try to remember where the other allowed is. And at the beginning, it's very difficult, but slowly students start to remember where the different cards are. But you can do this for all sorts of different aspects of pronunciation. So here's another one, Pelmanism, sort of for minimal pairs. You turn over hit and you have to turn over heat to create a pair, which you then keep. Word mazes, this is something that the writer Mark Hancock's very keen on. You choose your sound, in this case, and the top box is oo, and you think of all the words with the oo sound. You need to choose a word where there's different spelling patterns for that sound. So we've got through, and then you can spell through a different way. And you work your way through the maze. So students look at through in the top left box, and then they decide, does plow have that same vowel sound, or flew? Even though plow has the same spelling to through, it has a different sound. So they draw a line from through to flew, and then they have to decide between so or blue. And then they move to blue, and from blue, they're choosing between plow, thought, group. So they go to group and so on until they work their way through the maze to through. In ETPD, we include a blank one so the teacher can just design it themselves, basically. But the trick is to have the starting word and the end word, and then write in other words which have the sound to create the pathway, and then add in your distractor words afterwards. But those kinds of mazes are very simple to create, but they're kind of nice and challenging for students to find their way through the maze. So I've given you some tips on ways of formally presenting pronunciation, some ideas for noticing it, getting students to think about different accents, tips on scripting and so on, and some more game-like activities. Once you've written your set of materials, there are some big issues in pronunciation to consider. If you're selecting or evaluating, if you're selecting material or you're evaluating your own materials design, these are 10 questions that are worth considering. Certainly if you work on a course book project or a set of materials lasting a year, these are questions worth asking yourself. I just talked you through them briefly, but you can pause the video if you want and read them all first, because I realize there's a lot of text on the screen. But these are sort of 10 questions you might consider about the course book that you're currently using, or the course materials, and they're questions you could consider about your own materials design. If you're designing a course book, I would certainly make sure that I got at least one item of pronunciation every unit. I would look for 2 or 3. This goes back to Adrian Underhill's comment about pronunciation being Cinderella. It's often the pronunciation is often the bit that gets cut from course books and course materials. If there isn't enough space on the page, it always loses its status compared to grammar pronunciation. A way around this, question number 2 is, does it have featured sections? Is pronunciation given the same prominence as grammar and pronunciation by having its own section? Maybe it has its own box, big heading, equal status. Good balance between presentation and practice. So you might have your pictures presenting the mouth shape of pronunciation and then some practice exercises. Or maybe you've got a listening and students then listen and notice an aspect of pronunciation, and then there's follow-on practice. But you want that sort of balance between the two. You might look at whether pronunciation's integrated into grammar and vocabulary sections if you're taking a very integrated approach. With question 4, it's a sort of yes-no question, but it's not saying one is right or one is wrong. It's just getting you to consider, is it integrated or is it separated? And you may have a view on the best way that pronunciation is taught. Is it integrated or separated? But that needs to be reflected in your materials design. A balance between segmental, suprasegmental. So segmental referring to isolated phoneme work, and suprasegmental beyond the phoneme sentence level. So issues of intonation and connected speech, for example. You'd expect there to be a balance there. And it may be affected by level. A balance between productive and receptive pronunciation. I haven't mentioned these 2 terms yet, but what I'm meaning here is productive pronunciation practice is when you actually get the students to speak and say a word. So you want them to produce that sound. Or is it receptive? Are they listening to it and noticing it? This is a key issue, because if you're presenting pronunciation, say with British English pronunciation, and you get the students to produce it, is your material saying the aim of this material is to get you to sound like a British English speaker, whatever that is? Or is the aim just to get you to notice features of connected speech which may occur in certain types of pronunciation? That would be receptive work. Now, there is an argument to say, if students are doing receptive work to notice features of connected speech, they naturally want to have a go at producing it themselves. And you could argue that having a go at producing it, though that might not be the aim of the material, to get them to, for example, a sentence like, "Can I help you?" I might say in natural speech, "Can I help you?" So that it's connected, the word "can I." Somebody for whom English is their second language might say, "Can I help you?" That's fine, because they're going to get what they want. But when they listen to it in the course materials, they might want to have a go at saying, "Can I help you?" Again, it comes back to your view on approach, but you need to decide, have I got that balance between receptive, productive activities? Question 7. When you're making recordings, have you included a range of speakers with a range of accents, or are you just using one person? Often teachers complain about the recordings in course book because there's only maybe 3 different speakers and they're all coming, say, from Britain or America. The problem there is cost, because you can only get a certain number of actors just for cost reasons. So getting a variety of accents is actually quite challenging. However, I think it's got so much easier through video and access to real recordings of different people speaking. So perhaps the way around this with your materials is to have some control practice recordings with actors or friends recording it, maybe at sort of word level or sentence level. And then for activities where you want students to notice features of different pronunciations, you get your authentic recordings there, maybe off YouTube, or I know some people who make videos just with their phone. They record video interviews with people with different accents and make use of that material. TED Talks would be a good example of this, because you get speakers on TED Talks with very different accents, you can exploit the pronunciation in those videos quite effectively. Now that brings us to question 8. So does the book or does your course material, maybe it's online material, but does it include authentic recordings? So as well as having control practice, listenings of pronunciation, are students exposed to authentic recordings? We've said enough about that, really. Do the pronunciation activities look fun and motivating? That's linked to the sort of more game-like. There's a danger that all our pronunciation activities tend to be listen and repeat and at sentence level. So you want to include some sort of game-like activities where possible. And perhaps when you're looking at material, does it include online self-study pronunciation practice? So if you're designing materials to be used in the classroom, maybe you want to give students activities to do at home. So you can design sort of self-study materials. That might be using online materials in some way, maybe digital recordings. And a lot of the digital packages like Avalane, for example, which we've mentioned on the course, you can make recordings and upload the audio to create online materials quite effectively, which students can then use at home. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the 5 points I want to cover. But before we finish, here are a few suggestions for further reading. This is kind of an obvious one to start with: how to write pronunciation activities from EL Teacher to Writer. We've mentioned that before. There's a discount on this course. If you use the discount code in your pre-course information by Laura Patsko and Katie Simpson, tips on how to write those activities. It's not too long, it's nice, comprehensive, so good for ideas. Pronunciation actually, publishers used to publish a lot more individual pronunciation books. This is an absolute classic. Look, it's still got my name on the front from when I was a trainee teacher, Ship or Sheep. It's old now, it's like 30, 40 years old. But it's a good example. You do pick up copies, lots of pictures, lots of listen and repeat, but it's really a very good overview of lots of different issues connected with pronunciation, and an interesting read if you're a materials writer to think, what about it's still relevant today? In terms of issues of the theory and the issues of pronunciation, teaching the pronunciation of English as a lingua franca, I haven't gone into it too much because you can go off and read about it, but it's basically the issue of who shapes English nowadays. Is it people from Britain or America, or is it people, say, from Latin America, South America, Asia? Is it the English of the second language speaker that's shaping our pronunciation? And Robin Walker talks about the issues of what should we be spending most of our time on in terms of materials design as teachers to help students with pronunciation and to help them to be intelligible. So this one's a bit more methodology. It's interesting, it's reflective. I mentioned a little bit about scripting. My own book with EL Teacher to Writer, How to Write Audio and Video Scripts, I touch upon pronunciation a bit. It's more about script writing for listening, for video. But if you ever have to write scripts for pronunciation materials, you might want to refer to that. And then the last one I mentioned at the beginning, ETpedia Pronunciation. It's got 500 ideas and activity. It has a short section on writing exercise types for pronunciation, but you'll see a lot more of my ideas on pronunciation in that book. So I hope the session's given you a few ideas on how to approach pronunciation in your own materials. It is the bit that often gets left out. It's quite hard to write materials for it. When teachers see, a listen and repeat exercise, they're sometimes groan, but actually that stuff is really useful for students. But you can offset it with game-like activities. You can offset it with including authentic English, and as well as dealing with the listening aspect and the comprehension, you can pull out elements of pronunciation from authentic video. So play around with it, have fun with it. It's one of the most interesting areas of what we do as English teachers and English materials writers, as far as I'm concerned.